Okay, pretend the lights have blinked. It's time to start again. And thank you for staying with me. I know this is pretty heavy, and I do appreciate how well you've listened. And I will try my best to be efficient and effective in this second period to build on what we just did. It will be a very short introduction this time. You remember this passage, right? It's the same, ditto. We're making an argument from design. And we remember this because I just went through it. They're looking for evidence of life in the universe by looking for some signature of its technology. What is that signature? It's radio signals with information in them. My argument in this series, this section is, we have those signals everywhere in every living thing that say, design. They're all over the place. How do we miss it? How many of you have seen the movie Contact? Okay. How many of you have read the book? 2. Is that typical of our age? It is. The book's better, isn't it? Thank you. The book's better. The purpose of Contact, and by the way, you know who wrote it? Anybody know who wrote it? Carl Sagan. Because, ladies and gentlemen, in his lifetime, SETI and those efforts never found one thing. And they still haven't in 2020. So he wrote a book where they did. And the book Contact is built on the very notions I was telling you about in this lecture. Because do you see all those radio telescopes in the background? I mean, the point of the book is they made contact with guess who? Somebody in outer space. And in this book, which is fiction, it has not happened, but in the book it did. They got this signal from outer space. At a particular place in the universe, they discovered the signal out of the cosmic noise. And as a result of that signal, which I'll blow up here for you, they decided that came from an intelligent source. So let me take just a minute here and explain to you how it was they concluded that was an intelligent source that produced this signal. So watch, would you? You see those two right there? Those are bleeps on the radio telescope. Zeros are pauses. So you have 2 bleeps and a pause. Then you have, you say it, 3 bleeps and a pause. Then you have 5 bleeps and a pause. Then you have 7 bleeps and a pause. Then you have, it's a little harder to count, right? It's 11. And then you have 13. And what's the next one? 17. And then 19. Somebody said it already. What was the prime numbers? What's a prime number? How do you define it? Somebody that's divisible by only itself and 1. Right? Kids, are you with us? What you've got is prime numbers up there. In fact, on that message is contained the first 25 prime numbers in order using bleeps on the radio telescope. The last one in the 25 starts right here, and if you counted all those ones down here, you'd have 101. Did y'all know 101 was a prime number? It's divisible by 101 and by 1. That's it. Makes it prime. The question, ladies and gentlemen, was this. In this fictional book, does that signal indicate some intelligent source? And by the way, you remember the book I presented? I don't think I brought that book with me. Intelligent Life in the Universe. Remember I presented that to you last night by Sagan and Shklovsky? One of the things they wrote in that book is if a signal came from outer space that had in it the first 25 prime numbers in a row. That would be powerful evidence of intelligence. And that's precisely what they concluded from this signal. There is no evidence, ladies and gentlemen. In fact, there's negative evidence that nature could ever produce something like this without an intelligent designer. So in contact, they decided somebody was trying to contact us, so we're going to try to contact them. Now I want to switch just a moment to this subject. Here's an excellent little book called Design Inference by William Dembski. Dembski is a mathematician and a philosopher. He takes the position that you can mathematically analyze whether something was designed. And being an old math teacher, math is the queen of the sciences. And if you can describe nature mathematically, you've reached the highest pinnacle and you're thinking God's thoughts after him. He argues you can find out something was designed by analyzing it mathematically. I'm going to be very brief about this. He said there's only three ways an event could have happened. It either was inevitable, or it was an accident, that is by chance, or it was designed. Now, you may disagree with that. I don't. He argues those are the three possibilities for any given thing you could observe. So how do you answer which one it was? Well, he said you need to ask these questions. First, is it contingent? In other words, did it have to happen that way? Yes or no? If it had to happen that way, it was inevitable. In this case, the signal I just gave you certainly didn't have to happen that way. So the answer is it's contingent. The second question is it too complex to have happened by chance? So I ask you, ladies and gentlemen, 25 prime numbers in a row. Could that have just accidentally bleeped out somewhere or another? Well, maybe one chance in what? An infinity. But that's a hard question to answer mathematically, so the longest chapters in the book deal with this question right here. But you can answer that question yes or no in almost all cases. So if the answer is yes, it's too complicated to be by chance, then you need to ask one more question. Is it specified information? Specified. And what that means is you could produce that information some other way than how you saw it on this event. So class, let's do this. Can you produce the first 25 prime numbers not ever having known about that? Yeah, with your intelligence, right? All right, let's do it. Is 1 a prime number? No, it's out because it doesn't count for anything. How about 2? It is prime because you can only divide it by 2 and 1. How about 3? Yep. How about 4? No, it's divisible by what? 2, 4, and 1. How about 5? Prime. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. See, you can do this. I'm stopping. This will wear us out. But getting higher numbers, it gets harder, doesn't it? Because you got to figure out what can divide into that, if anything. But yes, we could produce that information, specify it ahead of time, and then we found it. He argues if you can answer that question yes, you're 99.9% certain that thing was designed. Because it was not inevitable, it's too complicated to be by chance, and it contains specified information. Those are powerful signs for design. Just for your interest. So what did they conclude in the book Contact with that signal? They said it was contingent, it was not necessary, it was complex, and it was specified in advance. So everybody in that book concluded this came from an intelligent source for the first time in the history of mankind. And they went searching to make contact. And I would say, amen. If that really happened, I would absolutely agree. But what if we received a message from space with a language that we could decode and read, as I just got through talking about? Why would that not send the same signal? It's way more complex than the first 25 prime numbers in a row. Way more. And that's what Meyer argues in this book. So I've told you now about the process, and I know you have all that down carefully about how it works. All of that was known by the 70s and early 80s. Starting in the late 70s and early 80s, we started studying DNA way more deeply. And we began finding out that a lot of this DNA was not used to do this stuff. In fact, I'm going to jump way ahead. Over time, it became evident that the great majority of the DNA molecule was not used to build proteins or to make ribosomal RNA and transfer RNA and messenger RNA. Most of it wasn't doing that. And you see this thing right here I told you about? You have to snip out the introns and mature the messenger RNA. The thought was, ladies and gentlemen, as we studied these things more, this is just junk here that has to be snipped out. And so, can you think of a logical question that somebody that's not a believer in God might ask? Why would a designer plan his copying so that after you copy it, you've got to edit it before you can use it? Why not just make it clean and copy it and then use it? And the argument was, introns are a good evidence that this was not designed. It was a result of a long evolutionary process where there were mistakes in it, mutations, stuff that happened, and this is what we've got left. So the more we began learning about DNA, the more the evolutionists and the atheists began to say, look, the cell isn't a good evidence for God. Do you people believe in God? Better watch out. In fact, it's a veritable graveyard of your evolutionary past, they would argue. The same is true in this process out here in translation and producing of the protein, they would argue. And all of you know that in the late 1990s, the people who were scientists in the biology realm decided, why not take the task of mapping the entire human genome? Some of you kids weren't alive then. This began in the late 90s, but all of you know, don't you, that the human DNA has been mapped in your lifetime. Certainly all of us in here know that. That was a tremendous task. You have no idea, ladies and gentlemen, how much work had to be put into that. Because the DNA is the longest molecule in nature. It is humongous. It has millions of nucleotides that all have to be mapped. So you cannot imagine the significance of this achievement. Francis Collins led this effort. And he wrote a book called The Language of God. And he's a firm believer in God, ladies and gentlemen. Now, he also believes in evolution. So he would tell you there's a lot of evidence in the cell and in the DNA that indicates evolution has taken place. But he puts God in where you add the spirit and the feelings and the thinking and all that. That's where he puts him. But he makes pretty powerful arguments in his book that the Human Genome Project has supported the evolutionary theory for the origin of this whole complex system. So we say there's a signature in the cell, but what about junk DNA? I was hit with this when I was giving a speech on the campus of USF in the mid-90s, and I knew nothing about it. No, pardon me, it was like 2005. But I didn't know much about this. It's hard to keep up with everything when you're doing a lot of other things. I mean, you can't read everything. So I had given a speech kind of like I gave you today and talked about the overwhelming evidence for the cell, and a professor stood up in the back and said, "Professor Payne, why haven't you told this class tonight? Now, you did a wonderful job of talking about this, and that is amazing. But what you didn't tell them is that as far as we know today, about 5% of the DNA is used to do what you just described. So what about the other 95%? Some say that the rest of the DNA is junk left over from our evolutionary past. And they say it rather vociferously and with great vigor, particularly if they are especially anti-creationists. And sometimes they say it in kind of ugly ways. Are Christians ever capable of saying things in ugly ways? And may I say to you, lest I forget to say it later, let's always be kind and gracious and humble in our approach, forceful but open, and let's not say ugly and foolish things in the discussion. That was thrown in free of charge. Let's see. I wanted to read to you some things that people said about junk DNA. So I'll start with our favorite author, to whom I've referred several times already. Let me find my place here. Should have had this marked. We're going to start with Richard Dawkins. You remember him? Here's what he said in 2004. Genomes are littered with non-functional pseudogenes, faulty duplicates of functional genes that do nothing while their functional cousins get on with their business in a different part of the genome. And there's lots more DNA that doesn't even deserve the name of pseudogene. It too is derived by duplication, but not duplication of functional genes. It consists of multiple copies of junk, tandem repeats, and other nonsense which may be useful for forensic detectives, but which doesn't seem to be used in the body itself at all. Once again, creationists might spend some earnest time speculating why the Creator should bother to litter genomes with untranslated pseudogenes and junk tandem in the DNA. Later, he said, the only use of all this junk is to mystify creationists, because even they aren't creative enough to think why God would make something 95% junk. I want to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, I was taken aback, because I didn't know what I was talking about that. And my message to you tonight is there will never be a time in the history of mankind till God comes again where there isn't something you don't know how to answer. You listening? I'm almost convinced that God will see to it that stuff is going to come up you don't know how to deal with, and you're going to have to take a step of faith when you don't know how to answer it and say, there's enough evidence for me, dear Lord. I don't know how to deal with this, but I still believe you are in control. And junk DNA was one of those for me. I didn't know how to deal with it. I mean, let me ask you, would you think it's reasonable that God made DNA 95% junk? Why would the Creator do that? I can't even imagine. Doesn't make sense. So it kind of threw a monkey wrench in this grand argument I just got through making. Didn't it? Kind of. I want to read you another one because it gets rather acidic. It is a remarkable fact, Dawkins wrote, in The Greatest Show on Earth, The Evidence for Evolution, in 2009, that the greater part, 95% in the case of humans, of the genome might as well not be there for all the difference it makes. In particular, pseudogenes are genes that once did something useful but have now been sidelined and are never transcribed or translated. What pseudogenes are useful for is embarrassing creationists. So what's a pseudogene? A pseudogene is something left over, they say, from your evolutionary past that used to work and now it doesn't. And yet it's still sitting there. So let me give you one that's brought up by every one of these guys. We have what they call a pseudogene for vitamin C. Do you take your vitamin C? I hope so, because your body does not produce vitamin C. Mice produce vitamin C. You don't. You have to take it to supplement your diet. Your body doesn't produce vitamin C. An evolutionist would argue with you that the reason you don't is because the gene for vitamin C production in humans has been mutated to the point it can't work anymore, and it's a leftover of your evolutionary past, and you're stuck with it because the DNA was mutated too much till that pseudogene was destroyed, basically, in terms of its functionality. And they would say that's a powerful argument that the gene is not made by God. It's a product of evolution. I pause to let things sink in. In addition to that class, there's a whole bunch of that DNA that is just repeat. Whole segments of desert, they would say. They call them lines and signs, long interspersed sections and short interspersed sections that do nothing, as far as we can tell, but take up space. Francis Collins said this: movable segments of DNA known as ancient repetitive elements, AREs, have no function other than their own survival. Some might argue, Collins wrote, that these are actually functional elements placed there by the Creator for good reason, and our discounting of them as junk DNA just betrays our current level of ignorance. And I would so argue. Indeed, some small fraction of them may play an important regulatory role, but certain examples severely strain the credulity of that explanation. He goes on to say these AREs, many of them are decapitated and utterly defunct. And they are in parallel positions in the human and the mouse genome, and it still works in the mouse, it doesn't work in us. I'm doing this on purpose, ladies and gentlemen, because I want you to know that when Abraham was told that his wife's going to have a baby, he knew enough biology to know that wasn't going to happen, right? And he didn't understand it. Did he believe in God anyway? And follow his principles. I repeat, Hebrews, the 11th chapter, verse 6 says, without faith, you want to say it with me? It is impossible to please God. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he's a rewarder of those that diligently seek him. There will never be a time, ladies and gentlemen, when you know with absolute certainty beyond any question of a doubt that there is a God. You're going to have to believe it. But he's given us plenty of evidence, may I suggest. But it's never going to be perfect so that you have all the answers. And I'm convinced, the older I get, there's another agent working, I'm sure you know, who's trying to throw monkey wrenches in everything. That can distort, dispel, and get you off track. And kids, listen to me. When I was at your age and this stuff was being thrown out about DNA and the proteins, and my professors were telling me, you folks in this room who believe in God better get over it. Because we're going to have figured out how life was constructed. We're going to be doing it ourselves in a matter of a few years. And let me tell you, 60 years later, I'd love to go back and talk to those professors and say, ladies and gentlemen, the picture today, 60 years later, is worse for you in terms of what we know about living things and how amazingly complex they are and how full they are of design, that you ought to be ashamed of yourself. But I sure didn't know it then. And it scared me to death. I thought, I don't want to go into science. I may learn so much that I'm going to give up on God. Don't you go there. You keep studying science to the depth of your ability, and what you'll find the more you learn is there's magnificent evidence for God out there. I think this is another example. So what about those introns? I'll tell you what started happening in the 2000s and up into 2010s. People started figuring out what that junk DNA does. And I'll have to defend myself a little bit. On that USF lecture, when the professor stood up, I didn't know how to answer that man. But I did say this. I said, sir, I don't know how to answer your question. I intend to do a lot more searching and digging and trying to find that out, as any good scientist. But I would say this to you, sir. I would be real careful about calling things junk. Because that's happened in the past in science. You probably don't know, class, that there was a time in the middle 1800s when a German scientist said your body contains 150 vestigial organs of your evolutionary past. Guess how many we think today are vestigial? And we're not so sure about those. Can you name a vestigial organ that they thought was vestigial? The appendix was number one. Is the appendix important to us today? Well, of course it causes problems sometimes. And we take it out and you can live without it. I got that. But the appendix we know is vitally important for a whole host of things that they had no clue about then. They thought it was just a leftover of your evolutionary past. You need to be careful about calling something junk, because it may just be you just haven't learned enough yet to know what's going on. Very quick treatise on the myth of junk DNA by Jonathan Wells, a well-respected scientist who's dug deeply, and he quotes hundreds of articles in here of scientists uncovering what junk does. Most non-protein coding DNA is coded into various RNAs. Did you know that there are a host of RNAs we never knew anything about 20 years ago? Not just transfer RNA and ribosomal RNA and messenger RNA. There's probably 150 different little RNAs. So the stuff that isn't producing proteins is making a whole bunch of other kinds of RNAs that we knew nothing about. Don't tell me it's junk. There are many non-protein coding sections of the DNA that, well, they're all conserved. That means in different organisms they have similar things, and what the evolutionists said is that means it's useful. The RNAs from this DNA play a significant role in controlling whether, where, and to what extent protein coding regions are transcribed. What we're learning, ladies and gentlemen, is that whole DNA thing is a massive computer-guided, as the way we would say it, process, a system to make all these things happen. It's like it's being guided. And the RNAs have a big part to play in that. And these introns that they thought was junk that you just throw away, no, what we found out is introns do a lot of stuff. They're rich in splicing factor recognition sites. They encode a majority of the small RNAs. Those little introns make RNAs. And the RNAs from the introns influence gene expression by modifying chromatin. That's just the beginning of the story. Ladies and gentlemen, you live in such an exciting time. We're going to figure out more and more that 95% junk does. And it's going to help us. Stored in the DNA are multiple messages stored in the same sequence of bases. Listen to me closely. I'm going to see what you remember from our last class. You're reading your DNA, right, as it unzipped? And you start reading AUG, you start reading, then you read three-letter words, and you have a string of amino acids, right? And then it stops reading. So here you have a string. Maybe it's 1,000 amino acids long. What you didn't know is that same strand, because of this editing process, we now know can produce as many as 1,000 different proteins by snipping and reorganizing. Are you listening? So our first thought was, why would you snip that stuff out and throw it away? No, ladies and gentlemen, they snip it out and make this particular protein. Then it's possible to snip it a different way and make a different protein, and snip it a different way and make a different protein. So the thing we thought was junk is in fact an amazing complex of things that were happening we knew nothing about. And let me see. You see this one? There are codes inside of codes. I hope I can find this story. Let me just see here. Just give me a second, because I didn't mark it. Well, I'll just tell you the story. I can't quote it exactly. During the Revolutionary War, there was a soldier in the army who got letters from home, from his wife. She was a sharp lady. She was constantly watching the movements of the Union Army. This guy was a Confederate. And she would send him letters that said, well, the family's doing fine, the kids this, and you lost a bull this time, and our cows are doing fine, and chickens and everything's going great. And that was what the letter said. But if you knew the code, you could find inside that letter what the army was doing and where their latest munitions sites had been set up and where they were right then. So inside the letter, there was another message. Now, folks, it strains the brain to think DNA could have been produced by natural causes. But how about DNA with a language in it that has a language and a code inside of the language? Which it does. And that's something else we're uncovering about this junk DNA. Codes inside of codes. Folks, that doesn't happen without intelligence. I'm sorry. Dual and overlapping messages. What about those pseudogenes? We've learned that some of those produce functional proteins. Some produced RNAs that suppress the expression of their corresponding functional genes. Some produce RNAs that increase the expression of their corresponding functional genes. In other words, we're finding out pseudogenes they think are pseudo aren't pseudo. Who told them they were pseudos in the first place? They did. Because they thought by comparing these things, you found out something that was pseudo. Well, we're finding out pseudogenes do a lot of stuff. So be at peace. The lines and signs and ERVs, endogenous retroviruses inside these things, they all are finding that there's some purpose in these long stretches of copied stuff. And similar to words and sentences and paragraphs, we're learning that inside the DNA there are genes, gene folders and superfolders and isocores that organizes that stuff so you can find it. How's your desk look at home? The information in the DNA is so massive, what we're learning is it's organized better than any human system ever devised. So the body can function. The more we learn about the supposed junk DNA, the more it appears to be designed. So I say, is it reasonable to believe in God in this scientific age? Everywhere we look, from the macroscopic to the microscopic, things look like they are made. Are there glitches sometimes? And there'll be more. But understand there's overwhelming evidence to believe in God. That's my lesson tonight. So I got through in 45 minutes on that one now. That was pretty good. So we have set aside a little time here to ask some questions. I'm going to get you out of here by 7 o'clock. And why don't you do this? Get up and shake. Come on, stand up and shake your body a little bit. And we're going to pick up your questions. I need to do calisthenics myself, and this is coming off. I'm burning up. Is it hot in here, or is it just me? That's coming off. All right, let me just do these in the order they happen to fall. Since the evidence is overwhelming, is it pride or ignorance that keeps scientists from admitting there is a God? That's a tough question to answer. I do believe there are reasons that people don't see. So let me ask you a question. Most everybody in this room is a Bible believer and believes the Bible is the Word of God, right? I think most everybody is. Have you ever changed your mind about a passage of Scripture you thought you understood? I hope you have. Are there some folks that have real trouble with that? Because they're convinced the way they think about it is right. And that the fundamental undergirding thing is supporting them. I think that's an element of this. Because scientists will tell you, some of them especially, that science can only deal with nature, and therefore any scientific answer to a question must be based on the natural answer. Your answer has to come from nature. Well, if you start there, then that rules out the supernatural, doesn't it, before you ever start? In fact, a number of them, and even in these court cases where we were trying to get some of the creationist views taught in schools, they argue before the judge, that's religion, this is science, and they don't belong together. Because that one's supernatural, and this is natural. Every scientific answer has to be natural. And let me tell you what my answer is to that. Science cannot investigate God with the methods of science because he's beyond nature. I get that. But can science point us to an amazing designer? Yes, it can, and we do it all the time. So there's where the difference is. And I think some scientists just don't get that idea, and they don't want to open the door. One of them said, Mr. Lewontin, PhD from Harvard, said, we are not going to let God's foot in the door. Period. So it's partly closed-mindedness and having your viewpoints set that answers the question. Second question is, how long from Genesis 1 till now? That's 2 o'clock tomorrow. And of course, I have the exact answer. You don't need to worry. That's an interesting question. We'll get to it tomorrow, God willing. What if a G and a T switch places in the RNA DNA strands? Would we explode? I don't have any idea. If a G and a, in the first place, chemically, I don't know who asked this question, but chemically, G and T cannot match up with the chemistry they have. It's not going to happen because of their chemical structure. It's not going to happen. They would have to change into something else. So the answer to your question is, that is a question that is based on non-possibilities. So you don't have to worry about blowing up. For that reason. All right, a second one on this card is, why do we use prime numbers in our bleeps from space? Carl Sagan did that because that was one of the things he suggested as a way we might know there's somebody out there if they sent us the first 25 prime numbers. But he also gave a whole bunch of other ideas in the book Intelligent Life in the Universe. So it's not just that one. That's just the one he happened to pick for the book Contact. That's the answer to that one. Let's see, there was a third one there. Why do we have junk DNA? I concluded, didn't I, that I'm not sure we have any junk DNA? The farther we go, the more we're learning that it's not junk. But may I add one thing to that I should have said already? Having some junk left over is not anti-God. After the sin in the garden, didn't some things change? And nature began to deteriorate. Romans, the 11th chapter says, creation is groaning and it's subjected to futility. Do you believe in mutations? You better, because they're happening all the time. You have mutations all over your body, inside your body. One of the things God built into your body is ways to get around those mutations and to help you still function. But some of them are lethal. So just because things deteriorate and die, does that mean they weren't made in the first place? You better not take that position. Deterioration is part of the way nature exists now. In fact, we call it the second law of thermodynamics, that nature tends toward disorder. So the fact that there's some DNA in which there are mutations is a fact, ladies and gentlemen. It happens. But that doesn't turn the DNA into junk. Okay. What's the difference between macroscopic and microscopic? Can you help me with that one? One of you youngsters want to help me? I don't want to pick on you. Do you know the answer? Let's use my arms. Is this macro or micro? And how about, that's micro. Macro means huge. Micro means tiny. And have we looked at both in this lesson, in this series? And everywhere you look, you see evidence of design. All right? What percent of the junk DNA is left unexplained? I don't know. But it's way less than 95%. Because they originally thought only 5% was functional. We know way better than that. And I would say we're in the process of uncovering more and more of the secrets of junk DNA. And I believe the idea of calling it junk is a myth. Okay? How does the scientific community respond to the notion of intelligent design being found in DNA? I've read to you some of the statements of a lot of them. They don't buy it at all. In fact, they would argue that it testifies to not having a God design it, as I've told you tonight. But there are others, and a host of them, who believe it does. So it's a mixed bag. And may I give you some good news? There are more respected, published, well-researched scientists today who believe in God than there were 50 years ago. The trend is good in my view. Now, do they believe in God the way you do exactly? No, but they believe there's got to be something. I showed you about Anthony Flew, didn't I? He wrote a book, There's No God, and then he wrote a book, There Is a God, based on his study of the natural world. So, it's mixed. As one ages, does the DNA strand have the ability to turn on and off in order for the body to age and deteriorate? That's an interesting question, isn't it? And I don't know the answer to that question, except I do know that things do deteriorate. And you have things mutate in your body. And they wear out, just like any designed machine wears out, doesn't it? It's just part of nature. So as to whether the DNA can be turned on and off, it certainly is in parts of it. And one of the interesting things we're learning about that junk is there is this system. You know, when you run a computer and you want to put certain kinds of software on it, it won't work if you don't have, what do you call it, for the whole computer to run? An operating system. So what operating system do you use in your computer? Anybody can name one? Say it again. Mac. We have Mac enthusiasts. Microsoft is another system. But that's a whole background system, and you put the software in it that works under the auspices of Microsoft, right? What we're learning is that the DNA has that capacity as well. There's parts of it that do different things to help oversee all the work that's getting done, and if they didn't, it wouldn't work. Non-computer people, did you follow me? All right. And so what I was starting to say is there are parts of the DNA that are turned on and off for a different reason. How do scientists explain irreducible complexity, and that is the I? That's tomorrow morning when is Bible class? Tomorrow morning at 9:45. Irreducible complexity is an expression that Michael Behe brought up in connection with some very complex systems like the eye, and we'll talk at length about that in the Bible class tomorrow. So don't miss that. So tomorrow, let me give you a summary. Bible class, we're going to talk about further evidence from complexity at the Bible class. I was going to say hour, but I think it's 45 minutes. I will. And at 2 o'clock, the theme is dinosaurs and biblical creation. But let me tell you, I'm going to spend a good bit of time on the age question in that lecture. So hope you can come back and be with us. Now I understand we're going to have another announcement, so we'll turn it over to Jason. And thank you for being here. May I say that it's been a real pleasure, and when I talk this long about this heavy material and you stay with me, it's really a compliment, because it's heavy stuff, but I appreciate it so much. And I hope, again, may I say, that you leave this series thanking God for the marvelous things that He is and that He does, more so than ever. That's my hope. Thank you.